Hi, hi.
I'm here.
So we can start the session. So we have these in-person participants already in this hall. So please feel free to start your session. Thank you.
Okay. I will be sharing my screen. I don't know. You confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. Good afternoon to all the participants. Good morning to the ones that we are in the European region. And welcome to these important sessions of water towers, downstream climate change vulnerabilities and adaptation strategies. We have invited Dr. Philippus Wester, Rinan Shah, Abu Tohid Hossein, and myself, Paula Pacheco, to be the panelist and the moderator of this session. I will explain a little of what we are going to talk about. Well, the objective of this session is to present and discuss risks and vulnerabilities of climate change faced by major mountain watersheds, and to present and discuss on a framework for climate change adaptation strategies to build climate resilience communities that are holistic, scalable, and translatable. The first part will be given by Philippus Wester, an Azimuth Fellow and Independent Water and Climate Change expert, and we will have three parts. Each of the parts will be a panelist and then a discussion, and at the end we will have questions and answers from the participants of the session. So Philippe, I will give you the floor to you. I will share your presentation, and again welcome to all the participants.
Thank you. Thank you, Paula, and thank you all. Very good afternoon in Bangkok, and good morning and good evening. So it's my pleasure to present to you the key findings of the cross-chapter paper on mountains in the recent IPCC Working Group 2 assessment report. As we wait for the PowerPoint to go live, just need to put it on full screen, Paula. Yes, thank you. So just a quick recap of the sixth assessment cycle. We had three special reports come out, including one on the oceans and the cryosphere, which had a chapter on high mountain areas. And then in February of this year, the Working Group 2 report with, as I was saying, a cross-chapter paper on mountains, and then the synthesis report coming up March of next year. And the reason to pull this out is just to highlight this was the first time in 25 years since the second assessment report came out in 1995 that we had a dedicated space for assessing climate change impacts and responses in mountain regions. So just wanted to flag that. Next, please. So the assessment scope, the delineation of the mountain regions, that were assessed in the cross-chapter paper. You're seeing it here, including population densities. Again, just to highlight, as part of the work of the cross-chapter paper, we did this delineation of mountain regions, and we did find 1.3 billion people living in mountain regions, and globally mountain areas occupying around 25% of the global surface, land surface. Now, 1.3 billion is a lot if you compare it, for example, to deltas and low-lying areas where you have 670 million people. That includes Bangkok, by the way. So huge number, nearly double as many people living in mountain regions than in low coastal areas. And of course, in the climate debate and analysis, a lot of attention to the island states and to the deltas. And I think we would like to see similar amount of attention for what's happening in mountain regions. Next, please. Okay. So as we wait for the next slide to come, yes, there it is. So some of the impacts, the assessment looked into close to, I believe it was 500 journal articles. This is coming out of the summary for policymaker figures. So we were very happy to see mountains make it into that figure. What you see here is climate change impact on ecosystems. Of course, we know there's a lot of changes in ecosystem structure in mountain regions, species range shifts, and changing timing. So we're seeing that. Next slide, please. And possibly more interesting for today's discussion, a lot of impacts on water scarcity and food production, which somehow doesn't seem to quite have made it onto the screen. Impacts on human well-being and impact city settlements and infrastructure. Next, please. So we're seeing observed climate change and the impacts. So one, it's clearly increasing. Two, really important, 2/3 of irrigated agriculture depends on water from mountains. So we're starting to see changes in mountain water availability coming from the mountain region, partly also because of the melting of glaciers, accelerated melting of glaciers. We're seeing negative effects on tourism and climate-related hazards. So, and this is already observed impacts over the past, 30, 40 years. Next, please. Looking forward, we will see continued increasing temperatures in mountain regions throughout this century. And we expect this will have negative consequences for the cryosphere, for biodiversity, for ecosystem services, and human well-being. And this is with very high confidence. Next, please. So looking at projected impacts at 1.5 degrees and beyond, I think as you all know, low elevation small glaciers will be lost at 1.5 degrees. And the tropical and mid-latitude mountains, 50% at least of glacier mass will be lost under low emission scenarios. But we're looking up to 2/3 to 90% of ice loss under the high emission scenarios. So a very significant change happening in terms of the ice storage in mountain regions. The strongest impacts of this glacier and snowmelt dependent regions, Central Asia, South Asia, Western South America, which is the Andes, and Southwestern North America, which is basically the Rockies, California. And what I found was really quite shocking. We are looking at increasing risk of extinction of up to 84% of endemic mountain species. So a very, very significant extinction event in mountains happening beyond 1.5 degrees. Including even just a little bit of overshoot, and when we come back down, very significant risks of very, very large extinction event in mountain regions. Next, please. So we assessed 4 key risks. Landslides and floods will increase significantly in the years to come. Changes in water availability, again, as I was saying, the mountain ecosystems and risk of mountaintop species extinction. And importantly, the intangible losses and harm to people and loss of cultural values due to these very significant changes in mountain regions. Next, please. So I'm just pulling out one of those key risks on damages to infrastructure from landslides and floods. It's quite a complicated figure, if you like, as IPCC figures tend to be. But just pulling out here at various temperature bands, we are seeing very high risk, high to very high risks on damages and losses from floods and landslides, especially the South Asia area. And the Tibetan Plateau. Next, please. So, also of importance for today's discussion, looking at adaptation and observed adaptation in mountains. And what we find is the speed, the scope, and the depth. So along all 3 dimensions are, quite slow, quite shallow, quite insufficient to address future key risks, especially going beyond 1.5 degrees. Next, please. So that brings me to my final slide. And again, this is coming from the summary for policymaking, summary for policymakers. And, you know, already, I thought this is really important also for our discussions, that climate resilient development is already constrained in regions and sub-regions in which climate change impacts are already advanced. And this includes low-lying coastal city settlements, small islands, deserts, mountains, and polar regions with high confidence. So sorry I couldn't have a more optimistic note to open up today's deliberations, but thank you very much and looking forward to the exchange. Back to you, Paula.
Thank you, Philippe. A very interesting presentation. I would like to give the floor, I would like to give the floor to Abu and Renan, and perhaps you can tell us something about how does climate change affect the life of the people living around mountains in your own regions, what is observed around there, and what are they doing about it? You have 5 minutes, each of the panelists, please.
Should I go first? Hi, everyone. In terms of the thing is, one aspect that Philip has just mentioned about climate change and observations in mountain towns, because I've been working on domestic water scarcity in the region for the past since 2014. What we have also seen is probably the focus largely being on visible climatic changes, for example, receding glaciers or disasters. Those are magnificent changes that you see. However, for what we have also seen are smaller water resources, which might not be, say, quote unquote, visible to everybody, like springs and the groundwater. So those aspects are something which almost like 70 to 80% of the, almost 100% of the mountain people depend on. But these are the smaller water sources have not, are declining, not only in terms of numbers, the number of sources that used to be, but also in terms of their absolute volume or the amount of water they used to discharge. And also in terms of quality, because what we have also seen with urbanization is that because in the mountains, the settlements are such that everything follows a natural drainage line. So you have your natural flowing stream, but beside that, you might also have a sewage system, sewer drain flowing through it. So the interchange between them, also due to inefficient sewage systems, might affect that interaction in groundwater. And in terms of I think for the situation that I've been working on, that is water scarcity, it is a situation that has been existing for the past 2-3 decades, and it is a persistent problem that is always existing. But what climate change does is it triplicates or it increases the problem all the more. So apart from, in addition to looking at climate change, there are certain existing systems and existing scenarios that also need to be handled. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Renan. How about Abu? What do you think about it? How does climate change affect the life of people living around your region?
Yeah, thank you, Paula, and good morning from European region, and also good afternoon in the South Asian region. So in my cases, I will start with what Renan just said, that climate change just increases the extreme things. I mean, the problems just increases because of the climate change. So if I start that in the mountains region, in the hilly region of Bangladesh, in the southeastern part, so there is already water scarcity. There has been water scarcity from the beginning, but nowadays we're seeing that it is just increasing. I mean, the flows are not like previous, it is decreasing. So we are trying to increase the flow of the natural mountain fountains. And also we are observing that water is coming from the upstream in the rainy season in a huge amount of flow. but in the dry season, the drought is becoming more hard. So we are getting water. What is resulting in a flood in the rainy season, but we are not getting the water when we need it. So this type of problems are becomes more extreme. The rainfall events are becoming more extreme. The temperature is going high in the summer. So the climate change just multiply by multiplying the problems what we already have. And also what Felix just showed in his slides, like the landslides. So when I was young, I mean, when I was a child, so I didn't hear much about the landslides, but nowadays we are working hugely on it because landslide is now happening on a larger scale. So that I wasn't much used to hear when I was a child, but now it is a huge concern for the government, for the community, and for also the road sector, because it damages our roads a lot, and also the livelihoods. So these 2 points, just because of the climate change, because of the factor that people are migrating from different places to places, so the burden on a certain community is increasing. The demand is increasing for the locality to give more service, more water for a specific community, because people are migrating from one place to another because of the water scarcity. So that is how I found that the climate change, maybe the southeastern regions, they are not much focused. They are not they don't emission a lot, but they face the consequences of the climate change. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Abu, for your comments. Philippus, I don't know if you would like to give some comments also on this first part of the presentation.
Yeah, no, thank you, and thank you both Rinan and Abu. I would fully agree with the point Rinan is making around the springs, the importance of springs in mid-hills, not only for municipal, drinking water, but for a whole range of other water uses also. And I'd be interested to hear maybe from you also, Paula, if that's an issue you're seeing also in the Andes. I know it's a huge issue in the Kush Himalayan region, that we are really seeing quite sharp decreases in spring discharge and also in the quality. And then yes, climate change acts as an amplifier, a risk amplifier related to those issues. I think both Rinan and Abu pointing out to that. So it's not just something happening in isolation. It's impacting on existing social structures and economies. And so yes, especially with the springs, there's a huge dimension around governance and how springs are being used. So it's not only climate change. We're also seeing springs being impacted by things like earthquakes, or being impacted by tunneling or by road construction. So there's a lot of different dimensions, but yes, changes in rainfall patterns, and importantly, I think this is where there's a knowledge gap. Snow melt, the importance of snow melt higher up in the mountains, and then the groundwater, the geohydrology. So how much of that snow melt is then actually recharging groundwater, which then becomes available further downhill in the mid-hills. Again, that's still largely an open research question, but as your snow melt starts to change, you have less snow. Could that be one of the factors impacting on decreasing spring flow? And that's similar with the question around landslides. The landslides one is indeed, it's a harder connection to make with climate change, right? You would say, how exactly does that work? Of course, with floods, it's very clear. You get more intense rainfall, more extreme rainfall events, and then of course you get more floods. But yes, there is also a climate change signal in the landslides. So part of it is of course, if you construct roads in mountains, the roads tend to fall off the mountain slide. That's the way it goes. It's not flat, and it's an unstable environment. But also, again, and this is due to the increased extremes, both wet and dry landslides. In terms of also heat, we are seeing these increasing. So yeah, back to you, Paula.
Yes, thank you, Philip. And just to mention that at the Andean region, we are suffering this almost the same impacts that you all three mentioned. We have extremes, more extremes. That means that the dry season, for example, is more dry, and the wet season it's coming with a lot of energy. So we don't have the infrastructure enough to collect all the water that we would like to collect for the dry season. The impacts are huge for the economy also, but also we can perceive impacts on the Mother Earth by itself, the biodiversity, but also the significance that mountains represent for the people living around them. At least for the Andean and also the Himalayan regions, mountains are very important for us, not only socially or economically, but also as symbols of energy and as symbols of our livelihoods itself. So, saying that, I will go to the next session, to the second part of our session, talking about, we will provide an overview of risk mapping approaches and sustainable transitions within the context of water.
Hello, Dr. Paula?
Yes?
Yeah, there's a small question from here. So can I ask a question?
Yes, we were thinking on giving the questions and answers part at the last, but I can accept perhaps
no, it's
one
okay.
or two questions at this part.
So I can keep
so
it
you
for
can,
the
don't
end,
forget your question.
I can keep it for the end, yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We will give time for the questions and answers. So as I was saying, the second part of our panel, we will provide an overview of risk mapping approaches and sustainable transitions within the context of water. And I will give the floor to Abu Tohid. I will share your presentation, Abu.
Sure, thank you. Yes.
Okay, now you can see.
Yes, thank you. So again, beginning with the fighting with climate change. So in my presentation, I'd like to give a brief idea how we should approach the risk analysis or assessment. So it is a broad topic, and I'll just mention some methodology we generally approach, but it differs from time to time, and it differs from region to region. So yes, next slide, please. So to give a general risk mapping approach, I have divided, we generally approach in 5 steps. So at first comes the analyzing the past and present climate impacts. And then it comes to the incorporating the climate projection for the future impacts. Then we identify the vulnerable sectors. Then it comes to the conducting actual risks and vulnerability assessment. And at last, we try to see the role of surrounding areas in adaptation, how we can adapt it in more. So I'll just go a bit details of all the 5 steps in the next slides. Yes, next slide, please. Yes. So why it is important to analyze the past and present climate impacts. So if we talk about Bangladesh, so there it is already surrounded by too many disasters, but it differs from the region from the European because of the geological location, of course the disaster will change, the climate impacts will be changed. So before analyzing the risks, we have to analyze what type of climate impacts it is already facing. So it helps the decision makers, and also it gives a better understanding of what we are actually dealing with. So there are many portals. So in that case, the data availability is a big factor because the data is not pretty much available. Government organizations are trying to build a database, build a solid database so that for in the future it becomes easy, because we know that the climate change, it does not happen in just 5, 10 or 20 years. So it takes time. It is not weather, it is climate change. So when we have a really solid backup data, it becomes easy to analyze things and take the decisions. So nowadays, I have shown two charts from the same website of World Bank Climate Change Knowledge Portal. So they have built by country-wise that what kind of impacts, what kind of disasters are country facing from 1982 to 2020. It varies from country to country. But yeah, there are also some national portal for individual countries to see the impacts. So in the first steps, we generally analyze the past and present climate impacts that is already the country or the region is facing. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. So when we are done with the analyzing the present and past impacts, then we tend to incorporate the climate projections and what would be the future impacts. I mean, if the temperature is rising, the rainfall is rising or decreasing in the summer, so the trend is changing day by day. So it is important for us to incorporate those changes into our exercise analysis approach. And for that, we generally follow IPCC6 as SSP nowadays. Before that, before the IPCC6, we tend to follow the RCP and try to project what could be the future temperature for next 10, 20, 30, depends on which term we are actually trying to find out the analysis. So in the next slide. Then it comes to identify the vulnerable sectors. Yeah, that it also varies, and there are many sectors that I haven't even mentioned here. So we need to find out the sectors for two reasons. One is to identify the impact on them. What is the most vulnerable sectors? What are less vulnerable sectors? And also to discuss with the concerned stakeholders, because it is needed to identify them and consult with them what actually they want, what are they facing. So it is really important to identify which type of sectors we are dealing with. If a reason just contain a industry or contain a urban area, so it generally differs what type of structure we will build or what type of initiative adaptation techniques we will follow. So it varies from sectors to sectors. Next slide, please. Then it comes when we are done with analyzing the past and present climate impacts. Then we have already incorporated the future climate projections, and then we have also identified the sectors. Then we tend to conduct the risk and vulnerability assessment. So I have just given the definition that risk assessment is generally the projected changes in climate conditions, inventory of potentially impacted assets, the likelihood of the impact happening, and the resulting consequences. And whereas the vulnerability assessments emphasize mostly on exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity of systems, assets, and populations. So this approach can be done in two ways broadly, because sometimes we go from top to down method, and sometimes we go from bottom to top. So what is top to down method? We do a desk job, we do an analysis, what type of risks that region could face, what type of data available we have based on the laws of the locality. So we try to find out what type of risks it is exposed to and what kind of vulnerability it is exposed to. So, and the bottom up is basically comes from the local region. So the stakeholders, the people say that what are they facing, what could be done to minimize the risks and minimize the vulnerability. So in general, they are not separated. We actually follow both of them because it is important. So at first, based on the data, based on the knowledge we have, we try to build up our risks and vulnerability assessment, what the impacts they're facing, what could be the risks, and then we try to go in the field and validate it, because it is really important to validate what we just think from our office that it might happen in that field, but when you go to the field, the scenario changes because the local live there, not us. So it is important to validate there and also incorporate their comments. So there are almost all the events, so they come up with some disasters, with some problems that we don't even imagine or don't even know, and also they know better what might be better for them, so what they actually need. So it is really important to propose something that goes with the local people. So at that moment it becomes easy to adapt. So otherwise we might propose something that is not feasible, the local is not willing to take. So it is really important to merge. We generally merge these two, so both the approaches are done and going forth. So when we are going to do the basic reporting, I mean, we have, based on the knowledge, based on the data, we try to build up a structure. So generally, the 4 or 5 topics generally try to include. The first comes with the trends of various climate variables. So it is related with the data. So if we have the data, we try to find out that what can be the average and extreme temperature, what could be the number of days of extreme heat the region is facing, what type of intensive rainfall events they are facing, is there any snow cover. So we try to analyze it based on the available data. Also, we try to find out what could be the direct and indirect impacts. I mean, if we identify the vulnerable hazards and as well as the city the risks are facing, and we try to incorporate the population, vulnerable population, economic activities, and try to find out what could be the major or direct impacts and what could be the indirect impacts if any hazard happens. Then also an important factor is time scale. We can do it for 5 years short term, like 2-3 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, or 100 years. So it depends on the time scale for what specific time we want to propose it, we want to do the risk analysis, so it depends. And also an indication of the level of confidence. I mean, when we are dealing with the model, I mean, we can't go in future and see what type of climate impacts are happening. So we have to model it, we have to analyze it, we have to incorporate it to things so that we can predict. So it is all based on the prediction. We are predicting what will happen in 2050, what will happen in 2070. So our prediction has a level of confidence. That sometimes we say that, yeah, there is a 80% chance it will happen, there will be 90% chance it will happen, or sometimes we say that it is 50-50. So not sure, the model is showing, but it might happen or it could not happen. So why this is important? It is important for the policymakers, because when they are going to adapt a policy or pass some our proposal, so it is really important to know what are really going to happen. If I'm not sure, if I'm 20% sure, then it is not good to pass the bill. So it is really important to give a level of confidence on what I'm proposing, what we're analyzing. Yeah, next slide, please.
Thank you, Abu. You have a minute to finish your presentation.
Oh, sure. So I'll just finish with the next slide. Yeah. Next slide. Yes. So the last was the understanding the role of surrounding areas in adaptation. So we really need to think what kind of adaptation we are going to take for the region, and it is important to concern everything. Not if we are going to protect the people or urban area, it is also important to keep the supply on, push supply on, keep the power on, keep the natural resources on, keep the amenities on, keep the medical services on. So it is not just the people, it is whole the people and also the structures. So it depends on which type of analysis and which type of adaptation we are taking. So I'm gonna end now, and there will be some slides that we're gonna talk later, because it is all about adaptation, financial constraint. So we can talk about that later. Thank you, Paula.
Abu. So perceiving all the impacts and then mapping or assessing the mapping risk and vulnerability approaches and methods. How about Philippus and Renan can tell us more about what climate change strategies and sustainable transition frameworks have been most successful in your regions to address climate change? What have you seen of what it's done at this time in your regions or in your own experiences? I will give the floor to Philippe first.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you very much, Abu, for that great presentation. Yeah, I'll speak to not so much a region, but what we were finding, in the IPCC assessment on mountains, and that was one of my last slides. In terms of adaptation, observed adaptation, so over the past 20, 30 years, we as part of our assessment, there was an effort called the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, and as part of that, we assessed 450 journal articles on adaptation in mountains along these three lines of speed, scope, and depth, and found that all three are very low, low to very low, across mountain regions, across the world. And what that's telling us is we're seeing what, in the IPCC terminology is incremental adaptation. So yes, peoples and societies and systems and cities are adapting, but it's slowly, it's generally more local, and it doesn't really, engage with system transitions. So the question, Paula, about what are you seeing in terms of successful approaches? I think what we're seeing is not so much, and we're seeing far too little, if set against the scale of the issue. That was the point I was making. At 1.5 degrees, which is around the corner, in the next 10 years, we'll be hitting that. The current adaptation efforts and the current approaches are vastly insufficient for dealing with the risks, the projected risks, the future risks. That's at 1.5. And beyond 2 degrees, it simply becomes next to impossible. And that's a finding coming out of the summary for policymakers of Working Group 2, right? And especially for these very vulnerable regions, such as mountain regions. We're basically seeing, beyond 2 degrees, you can no longer adapt. So one, urgent need for transformational adaptation, but two, an appreciation how constrained that is in terms of future global warming levels. We cannot adapt our way out of this. At some point, we will hit hard limits. We are already starting to see that happening in these sensitive regions, including mountains, and we'll see more of that, of course, yes. And Abu, I'd be very interested in your additional slides on financing and national adaptation plans. And yes, the whole financial issue, the governance issue, the loss and damage issue, all of that is there. So there's a lot of soft limits to adaptation. But I think especially in mountain regions, we really need to appreciate that above 1.5 degrees, things already become very difficult. Beyond 2 degrees, we are really, really looking at a very, very dire consequences, and would need to be starting to think about something very different in terms of, managed retreat, having to leave mountain regions, and as I was saying, also showing, the significant loss of biodiversity. So in short, we want to be pushing the mitigation agenda and really making sure we don't go beyond 1.5 degrees. And that's, of course, the huge global challenge. And I know we're all working on that and trying to figure out how to do that. But I think the scale of the challenge, the issue, and, the dire consequences of impacts beyond 2 degrees in mountain regions are really something that we need to shift out of our kind of usual mode of, oh, we need to be planning and having some adaptation and etc. It's actually, well, that's not going to be enough. Back to you, Paula.
Thank you, Philip. Would you like to add something, Renan?
Thanks for that, Paula. I think I had a few points, but which were most to do with as they are called soft limits rather than hard limits. One thing we also saw while we were also reviewing the efficiency of adaptation is, even if we carry out adaptation, how do we measure the efficiency of adaptation? So probably even if things are happening, do you know if it's actually happening or not? I think that's one question that we still have to figure out, because it is a very, there are multiple stressors, there are multiple drivers that affect whether a certain intervention works or not. In the case of India, I think we have the national policy on climate change, which then has been asked by the different states of India to create their own state action plan for climate change. This was way back in the early 2010s. And I think most of the times what happens with policy making probably is, you use the keyword and then you add it to your policy. So if it's climate change, you add climate change to your policies. If it's, if it's disaster management, then you're adding disaster risk management to your. So I think apart from, how do we integrate it? And how do you actually see that it's happening on ground? I think one way in which the operationalization of National Climate Adaptation Fund, climate change was done was through the National Climate Adaptation Fund, through which different towns and cities in India were given funds to, to work on climate change adaptation interventions. And the field site that I work in Darjeeling town, they have also been given, they have also been provided certain, rainwater harvesting systems to carry out climate adaptation. But so it's mostly infrastructural interventions as we might see it. So I think one thing is, how are we looking at climate change from the existing problems? Because, I mean, problems will exist, have been existing for a long time. So how do you, create one additional aspect to your working, that is climate change? And I think one interesting thing that is, especially in the mountain regions, is because there is heavy migration, out migration of younger people for employment. So initially it used to be, it's for education and employment. For example, I also no longer live in the mountains, but I have to live outside. For educationally, the elderly are left behind. So in such scenarios also, where where the quote unquote young and able people are outside the towns and outside the mountains, how would you then look at very local kind of look at the population there is, and then look at how climate change adaptation measures can be taken? I think that's also an important factor. Thank you.
Thank you, Renan. Very important points of view. How about Abu? Would you like to add something to this part?
Yes. Thank you, Philip and Renan, for raising the important things. I mean, one that Philip mentioned, that it is more local. Now we are working on more local things, not on a global perspective. And we can say that we should measure the adaptation, because it is not short term. I mean, if we are implementing some adaptation, we cannot see the result by tomorrow or by the end of the month. So it takes some time. So there comes the concept of the sustainable transition. So what does a sustainable transition mean? So it works on the long-term basis. It also integrated way. It works in an integrated way, and it works on the global perspectives, not like for a region or for a local area. So we have to consider the global perspective. We have to consider we need to think about the earth, not just a country. So, and we need to think about for the long term. So here also the thing comes that, is it climate justice or it is climate politics? So a lot of things comes with this topic, and we cannot measure, because we don't have that kind of data to, or we cannot rightly predict what can happen in in 2100, but we have to take some adaptation. We have to take some measures. Otherwise, that would be really tough. That's going to be really tough. And just a few points to add, like the adaptation, like you're saying, that successful adaptation. So here also comes that if when adaptation measures is contradicting with other one, I mean, if like what is adaptation? Like the temperature is increasing, so I'm just increasing my AC, I'm just lowering my AC temperature. So that is not adaptation, because that is contradictory with the climate change impacts. So I'm not adapting it. Rather, I am just contributing to the global warming. So we need to be careful that what adaptation measures we are taking. So is that contributing to the contradictory with the main theme of the climate impacts? And also it shouldn't affect the other areas. I mean, if a country is taking some actions to mitigate the climate change impacts, it shouldn't just negatively impact the other areas, other countries. So it should be collaborated. It should be on a global perspective. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you very much, the three of you, for collaborating in this second part of the panel. And now we will go to the third part, which is very important because it's translating knowledge into action. In this, Rin and Shang will give an overview of collaborative approaches to translate this knowledge into action and policy making. She will talk about how to collaborate with government, regulators, communities, integrating the sector and the interest into policy making. Rinan will be sharing her own presentation, so I give you the floor.
Thank you, Paula, for that. I'll just share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I think I'm the closest to Bangkok time from among all the panelists. So in a way, you might find my presentation repetitive because it is eventually drawing from what Abu and Philip and Paula have been talking about. So we might look at it as some kind of, the concluding slide also. So I'm contributing towards translating knowledge into action for this part of the panel discussion, that is water tasks, downstream climate change vulnerability and adaptation strategies. Here I would also like to mention that the IWRA Mountains and Plains Working Group have come together to do a short expert review on the different climate adaptation and vulnerability strategies taking place across the highlands of the world. And so I will be drawing some of the insights from that collaborative approach as well. As mapped by Seri et al., the mountains, as we think of, are of different kinds. You have the high mountains, the low mountains, scattered high and scattered low. However, for our review, we have only focused on the high mountains. That's the Andes, the Rockies, the Alps, and the Himalaya. In line with what the World Water Day 2022 announced as, making the invisible visible, where they mentioned that groundwater, which had been invisibilized by the importance given to surface water, so groundwater should also be brought into the dialogue and should be paid much more attention to. I think, according to me and the experience that I've had, I also think the policy making process is something which is invisible and should be visibilized. Because in the case of especially early career researchers and practitioners on ground, or even the local communities, what we see is that we do not have access to the process. So we are not fully aware of the process of policy making, which makes it difficult for us to then we also do not have access to the people who are involved in policy making. And lastly is simply the information as to how a policy making approach takes place. That is also something which we are lacking at the moment. As Timberlake and Schools have rightly pointed out that in order to convert scientific knowledge into implementation, firstly, we need to handle the complex boundary concepts. I think we'll come back to this again. Boundary concepts here, I could draw from the physical boundaries that we have, or the administrative boundaries, as well as disciplinary boundaries. And I think what they say is, and in order to enable this conversion, we require long-term partnerships as well as dynamic governance structures, which helps us, carry on the long-term partnerships that exist. Focusing on the geographical, or what do you say, the landscape that we are engaging with, which is the upstream, downstream, and automatically you think of the mountains and the plains, and that's what we are looking at. This landscape also, which it from the mountains to the foothills and the plains, are in many cases experience societal and spatial marginalization. Marginalization we see in the case of, by the nature of the landscape it is, because of the topography. And societal marginalization has also been seen in many parts of India, as well as Latin America, and where there have been difficulties in economic dependence, independence, or even in terms of how politically represented you are. So I feel the landscape itself is societal. It faces marginalization on different levels, and what happens when the biophysical changes occur in the highlands as well as on the downstream is that any biophysical effects also affect the water governance and management. Unfortunately, though the latest IPCC report has been released, but long-term implications of the interconnectedness between the mountain watersheds and the downstream environments are still yet to be, need to be much more clear. And disaster is an important concept. And if I have time, I would just like to narrate an anecdote here, where I was doing a workshop with school children from across the world, and I was asking them, how do you see water for yourself? How do you see water? How have you interacted with water issues? And my expectations were that they would only talk about, quantity of water, pollution of water. But some of the students, one of the students from Southeast Asia did mention, her interaction of water with floods and cyclones, which also shows that disaster as an important concept, a component, but it still has, I think it needs to find place in the upstream, downstream dialogues. I think this is repeating what Abu mentioned about risk mapping and strategies, where we need to focus on historical information and historical experiences of hazards, as well as the level of local vulnerability, and create a systematic database if possible. And it also has to consider the different kind of communication gaps, poverty and inequality, and many other regulations that fail to get implemented on ground. And in order to provide strategies, we need to have technical and planning initiatives, but also keep in mind the preparedness of the local people and institutions. For the paper that we are collectively writing, I have focused on governance, institutions, and environmental laws, where we looked at strategies, institutions, negotiations, and governance. And we could largely divide it into 3 levels, which was the global, regional, and local, in terms of how these functions took place. At the global level, we are mostly looking at the polar and the mountainous regions. I think one thing which needs to be considered is also the location of the mountains themselves, because some of them are located in developed countries and some of them are in developing countries. So that the kind of difference between that also needs the cold places of the world also needs to be contextualized in the way as to where the mountains itself are located. And there have been examples of developing countries seeming to be more proactive in terms of climate change adaptation measures in the mountainous regions. And we need to understand the multidimensional changes also occurring on the socioeconomic and other fronts. Most of the interventions that we looked at were happening at a regional level. By regional level, I mean happening for the Himalaya or for the Alps or for the Andes or the Rockies. And but there was a certain policy, there was a certain discrepancy to it, where policies made at the regional level failed to take into consideration the micro scale. And I think this is a case in the case of India, because India has a national water policy, which is a very simple document. And India being geographically variant, to what extent can you go to include all the geographies involved? So I think that is one thing that the different regional governments might also be facing difficulties with in developing a policy for their state. And some initiatives have talked about incentivizing subnational governance or the levels below them in order to carry out climate adaptation measures. At the local level, I think all three of us, four of us have again and again mentioned about how communities and their considerable knowledge need to be looked at. And what happens, especially in terms of disasters, is that there are existing informal systems which are already in place, but the reactive measures of the state sometimes work against them instead of working with them. So I think that is one important thing that we need to keep in mind. And secondly, the changes that is happening at the environmental and socioeconomic level are at a much higher speed than how the local institutions and communities are advancing. So that gap might in a way affect the local institutions and disabling them from carrying out further adaptation mechanisms. In terms of the mountains, we saw that the major mitigation methods are increasing capacity of lakes and reinforcing of glacial dams. They have been expensive and untrustworthy in case of mountain hazards. And some of the intervention measures that have been carried out are early warning systems, traditional knowledge, community level initiatives, and adaptive management. Let us discuss about boundaries a little. So in this image, you see on the foreground is the Meghalaya or the Shillong hills, and on the background is the Bangladesh plains, which are filled with water. So I think the continuity of landscapes occur, but the administrative and political boundaries sometimes render decision making difficult. So I think that is one step going forward, because we have looked at how transboundary aquifers are as well as rivers are. Additionally, interconnectedness of natural resources, for example, the oceans and the air, and how the effects on one aspect can affect the other, also needs to be looked at, and also the lack of support that is not unavailable for marginalized landscapes such as this. Ending on a little positive note and the way forward, some best practices that we have come across, not best practices because we cannot judge them immediately, but some of the practices that have been taken up. What we want to talk about is how local institutions and knowledge need to be integrated with climate sciences. A way in which this was done was the Karnataka state water policy. Karnataka is a state in south of India, where I'm currently living, where the Karnataka Knowledge Forum, which had participants from across academic and research institutes of Karnataka as well as different sectors, came together and wrote the state water policy, which was accepted here. What we have also seen is majority of the adaptation measures are community-led level, and community-led adaptation measures always have created an impetus. For example, we know about the early warning system in the Indo-Gangetic Basin as well as the solar irrigation measures. In the Alpine region too, in terms of looking at policy, actively the government of France has actively included vulnerability and climate change aspects into the urban planning and tourism development. So I think these are some ways in which the state, the community, as well as the different actors can come together in terms of carrying out effective adaptation, as well as measuring whether adaptation is successful or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rina, for your important presentation. And I would like to ask also Philippe and Abu if you can talk a little about what climate change adaptation strategies and sustainable transition framework have been most successful in your region? How about also what collaboration models can be successful in advances to sustainable climate resilience? What other strategies would you think can work to adapt to climate change and to respond to the impacts? Abu, I will give you the floor first.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rian, for the beautiful, nicely presentation, because the topics are really important when we say about the transboundary. Sadly, we don't work on it much, but yeah, we say a lot about it. So I will start with the transboundary thing. We see the surface water. We say that, yeah, the river water sharing approach should go on, but we don't talk much about the groundwater, the water aquifers. So there are no mentionable deals. I mean, there is none between India and Bangladesh. As I'm living in Bangladesh, so I have a knowledge about that reason. But yeah, we have a surface water treaty. So, but there is not, even 10, 20 years ago, there was not much talk about the groundwater, about the aquifers, but they are really polluting large way, and they are being emptying in a fast way. So we need to think about that too. Having said that, what Paul asked, that again, the successful adaptation, that is not easy to define, and in cases of if I just relate with what Renan presented, like the access is really important to the local people. She mentioned that the process and the people and the information. So they are not really going, the information is not dispersed in a proper way so that the local people know it. It might be a language barrier, it might be a concept barrier, but the local people should be informed about what type of actions the local authority is taking. Is that goes with them, or it doesn't go with them? So it should always be communicated. So a successful adaptation, it really depends on the people who are living there, not what we are thinking from the upper hand. So it's really important. I'm not gonna go in depth because I think we are running short of time. So thank you. I'll just give to Philip.
Yeah, thank you, Abu. Those are really good points, and I think what we're seeing, Renan, thanks for that presentation. The scale mismatch, right? So, or mismatches across scales. So the scope of the challenge, and then the response, and the mismatches there. So these governance challenges. Now, I think in terms of approaches, Paula, that you were asking, I think we are seeing encouraging transboundary regional cooperation mechanisms starting to develop in mountain regions. So Renan mentioned about France and the contribution there in the Alpine region. So we do have the Alpine Convention and the 8 countries of the Alps coming together to work, for a sustainable Alpine region and to tackle climate change with the Alpine Climate Board. And they've come out with their own climate action plan for the Alps. Similarly, the Carpathian Convention, but also I would mention the Andean Mountain Initiative, bringing together the 7 countries of the Andean region and working on a climate action plan. And then, of course, the Hindu Kush Himalaya, the 8 countries, and with ISTIMOD there, also wanting to work towards some form of regional cooperation. And we had the first ministerial mountain summit in October 2020. So I think you are starting to see, or you are seeing in across the globe, that regional approaches are starting to rise to the challenge. But of course, with all of the issues that were just presented and discussed, something else that I would like to bring in that I think would also really be interesting to take on board is around air pollution and air quality, right? So yes, climate doesn't know boundaries. Similarly, air pollution doesn't know boundaries. And tackling air pollution and improving air quality, I think there's a lot of issues there that could potentially have very positive impacts. So we all know that, the air pollution, of course, is very damaging for health and, reduces life expectancy anywhere from a year to 5 years if you live in highly polluted areas. But it also reduces crop yields. It also intensifies monsoon. It also leads to more rapid melting of the glacier. So there's so many connections there. And it is relatively easy to improve air quality. We have the technologies, we know how to do that, and I think there are promising examples starting to emerge. So it's not directly, climate change adaptation to climate change, but it is part of that puzzle. And I think bringing together countries sharing mountain regions and tackling air quality, air pollution issues, which I think we would all agree is a good thing to do. Right. So I think there's also that mismatch between some of the changes would really require, and I think, the transboundary water is one of those, that's a real difficult nut to crack. But something like air pollution, surely we can come together at all levels to figure out how to tackle that. So thank you very much. Back to you, Paula.
Thank you, Philippe. We have already transited from an interesting presentation, interesting panel from the impacts on the mountains to the emphasis on getting the information and analyze the past and the present behavior of climate, to the importance of collaborative models and adaptation strategies. So I will now give the floor to the persons who are there in presence, looking at the presentations, and you can have questions to the panelists, please.
Thank you, Paula. So do we have any questions from here? Anyone? So Paula, we don't have any questions from here. I would like to thank you for successfully conducting this session and for all the lively discussions. I would like to also thank all the speakers and panelists, Philippus, Abu Tahid and Rihan, for their insightful thoughts. And I would also like to thank all the participants here. And I hope that you will continue to follow the third day of our conference tomorrow with the closing. And with this, good day and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.